What if the perfect family next door was a carefully constructed nightmare? A couple who adopted a dozen children, not out of love, but for a purpose so dark it would shock an entire nation and redefine the meaning of evil. This is not just a crime story, it's a descent into a twisted gospel of suffering. Welcome back to Roots of Fear, where we uncover the darkest stories hidden in the shadows of seemingly ordinary lives. Today, we dive into a case that will make you question the very foundations of what we call family. This is the macabre history of the Follings. A couple who adopted 12 children over 15 years, none of whom had birth certificates. What began as a heartwarming story of generosity quickly unraveled into something far more sinister. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to the Ghastly Journal and turn on notifications so you never miss our weekly descent into the darkest corners of human history. Now, let's begin. Hardly the kind of place where you'd expect to find a story so disturbing it would attract federal investigators, the small town of Millbrook was nestled in the rolling hills of western Pennsylvania. With a population of just under 3,000 people, Millbrook was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where community potlucks and high school football games were the social calendar highlights, and where neighbors still brought casseroles when someone fell ill. It was in this idyllic setting that Howard and Margaret Folling made their home in the spring of 1978. The Folling residence was a sprawling Victorian mansion on Elm Street, set back from the road and partially hidden by a copse of ancient oak trees. The house had been vacant for nearly a decade before the Follings purchased it, and the locals had begun to call it the haunted house on the hill. But Howard Folling, a successful investment banker from Pittsburgh, saw potential in the dilapidated structure. He and his wife Margaret, a former pediatric nurse, spent a small fortune renovating the property, transforming it from a crumbling eyesore into the envy of the neighborhood. They seemed like such a lovely couple, recalls Elaine Winters, who lived across the street from the Follings for nearly 20 years. Howard was always impeccably dressed, even when he was just checking the mail. And Margaret, well, she had this way about her, so poised, so elegant. They were the kind of people you'd want to invite to dinner, the kind who made you feel important just by talking to you. But beneath this veneer of respectability, the Follings harbored secrets that would eventually shock the entire community. According to public records, Howard and Margaret were unable to have biological children of their own. This was a source of great sorrow for Margaret, who had always dreamed of a large family. She used to watch the neighborhood children playing from her porch, says Winters. There was something so sad about it, the way she'd just sit there for hours. I remember thinking at the time that she would have made a wonderful mother. And indeed, it seemed Margaret would finally get her chance at motherhood when, in the summer of 1980, the Follings announced they had adopted a baby boy named James. The community was thrilled for them. Neighbors organized a surprise baby shower, and the local church held a special blessing ceremony. James Folling was a beautiful child, bright-eyed and quick to smile, and the Follings doted on him obsessively. Margaret wouldn't let anyone else hold him, remembers Clara Jenkins, who attended the same church. Not even at his blessing ceremony. When the pastor asked to hold him, she got this look on her face like a cornered animal. In retrospect, this possessiveness might have been the first red flag, but at the time it was easily dismissed as the natural protectiveness of a new mother. Within 2 years, the Follings had adopted a second child, a girl named Elizabeth. Then in rapid succession came Thomas, Catherine, and William. By 1985, the Follings had 5 adopted children, all under 6. The speed with which they were able to adopt was unusual, especially given the typically lengthy adoption process in Pennsylvania at that time. But Howard Folling was wealthy and well-connected. They were seen as saviors, says Detective Richard Cooper, who would later lead the investigation. Here was this wealthy couple taking in children who might otherwise have grown up in the system. Who was going to question that? But there were oddities that, in hindsight, should have raised concerns. None of the Folling children attended public school. Margaret insisted on homeschooling them. The children were rarely seen in town, and when they were never allowed to stray far from their parents' sides. I remember she told me about a room on the 3rd floor, says Emily. The door was always locked, but she could hear sounds coming from inside, shuffling, and sometimes crying. Susan's concerns grew when, in the spring of 1993, she spotted a child she didn't recognize peering from a 3rd-floor window. When Susan mentioned this to Margaret, Margaret laughed it off. But Susan had met all the Folling children, and she was certain this was someone new. Around the same time, Michael Fletcher was working on a series of articles about adoption fraud for the Gazette. Dad never specifically connected this to the Follings, says Emily. But I remember him telling Mom that the timeline matched up. Whether by coincidence or design, it was shortly after Michael's articles were published that the Follings announced they were adopting again, a set of twins named Peter and Paul, followed by a girl named Mary, bringing their total to 11 children. Looking back, it's clear they were taking advantage of loopholes in the system, says Cooper. They would specifically request children from difficult backgrounds, children who were less likely to have complete records, children who might slip through the cracks. But why? What possible motive could the Follings have? It wasn't about money, Cooper insists. The Follings were already wealthy. The truth, when it finally began to emerge, was far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. The final, heartbreaking clue would come from a deathbed promise, a final act of courage that would finally set a reckoning in motion. In the fall of 1994, Susan Fletcher was diagnosed with breast cancer. As she faced her own mortality, she decided to share her suspicions with someone who could act. She called me to her bedside one night, remembers Cooper, then a junior detective. She had this file, pages and pages of notes. She made me promise that I would look into it after she was gone. Susan Fletcher died on June 12, 1995. Cooper kept his promise, though initially he proceeded with caution. The Follings were powerful. Cooper began reviewing public records and discovered the couple had worked with at least 5 different adoption agencies across 3 states, making substantial donations each time. He also discovered strange trust funds Howard had established for each child. The money was only accessible at age 25, and only if they met certain conditions, including not seeking information about their biological origins. It was about control, Cooper says. Everything the Follings did was about control. Armed with this information, Cooper began a more direct investigation. He discovered that household staff never lasted long. They'd suddenly leave town, Cooper notes. It was like they vanished. One former housekeeper, Maria Vasquez, had left in 1991. Cooper tracked her down to Ohio. Initially, she refused to speak. But when Cooper showed her the file Susan Fletcher had compiled, something changed, Cooper recalls. She started crying. She said, "So someone else knows, someone else has seen." And then she started talking. According to Vasquez, the Folling children were. His breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Emily Fletcher. Now 19 and studying journalism, Emily had been researching missing children cases from the regions where the Follings had adopted. "I found a pattern," Emily says. In at least 3 instances, when the Follings adopted a child from a particular area, there was a report of another child going missing from the same area within a month. Emily shared her findings with Cooper, who used his law enforcement access to dig deeper. He discovered that in each case, the missing child had never been found. It was like these kids didn't matter to the system, Cooper says bitterly. Like they were disposable. Armed with this new information, Cooper bypassed Chief Wallace and took his case directly to the Pennsylvania State Police. A warrant was secured for a dawn raid on the Folling residence. We knew we had to move quickly and decisively, Cooper explains. If the Follings had any warning, they might destroy evidence or, worse, harm the children. On the morning of October 23, 1995, a convoy of unmarked vehicles approached the Folling estate. Howard Folling, dressed in a silk bathrobe, answered the door. He was expecting us, Cooper says. He was completely calm, completely in control. Margaret was a different story. She became hysterical and had to be restrained. The search began methodically. The 11 known Folling children were found in their bedrooms, all awake despite the early hour, all dressed and sitting on the edges of their beds as if awaiting inspection. They didn't react to our presence, Harper would later report. It was as if they had been emptied out. The true horror was discovered on the 3rd floor. As Vasquez had testified, there were 3 locked rooms. When officers broke down the doors, they found 3 children, a girl of about 10 and 2 boys around 8. Unlike the Folling children downstairs, these children reacted with terror, Cooper says. They cowered in corners, hiding their faces and whimpering. The conditions were deplorable, Cooper says, his voice tight with anger. The rooms were bare except for mattresses on the floor. The smell was overwhelming. Medical exams later revealed all 3 were severely malnourished and showed signs of physical abuse. None had birth certificates or adoption papers. They were ghosts, Cooper says. Children who had been erased from the world. The discovery transformed the case into something far more sinister. The FBI was called in. Howard and Margaret Folling were arrested on the spot. As she was led away, Margaret broke free and screamed something in a language none of the officers recognized. That was when I first began to wonder if there was a religious component, Cooper says. It hinted at something deeper, something ritualistic. With the Follings in custody, the focus shifted to the victims. The 3 hidden children were placed in foster care, the 11 adopted children were housed in a group home. Interviewing them proved challenging. The adopted children gave only scripted responses. The hidden children were too traumatized to communicate. Dr. Evelyn Mororo, a child psychologist, worked with them. The journal revealed Margaret classified the children into 2 categories, the redeemables and the vessels. The 11 adopted children were the redeemable, to be purified through discipline. The vessels, like the 3 children found on the 3rd floor, were to be used as receptacles for the sins being purged from the redeemable children. And once a vessel was full, Cooper explains, they would be discarded. The journal referenced a resting place on the property. A search with cadaver dogs led to a wooded area where excavation revealed the remains of 5 children in shallow graves. The medical examiner estimated the oldest burial was from around 1981, the most recent was less than a year old. All had died from malnutrition, dehydration, and exposure. 3 of the 5 were tentatively identified as children reported missing from areas where the Follings had adopted. The other 2 remained unidentified. That's the thing that still haunts me, Cooper says. Those 2 kids, they died without names. The legal proceedings were complex. Howard's defense painted him as an oblivious participant, consumed by his work. Margaret was deemed incompetent to stand trial due to a severe delusional disorder and was committed to a psychiatric facility. Howard then negotiated a plea deal, offering information about other vessels in exchange for a reduced sentence. He pleaded guilty and received 25 years to life. His information led investigators to 3 more properties, where the remains of 8 more children were recovered, bringing the total to 13 victims. 13 vessels for 12 redeemable children, Cooper notes. In Margaret's twisted logic, there had to be more vessels. It was all part of her sick arithmetic of salvation. Of these 8, 5 were eventually identified. All came from marginalized communities. The Follings were predators, says prosecutor Meredith Lane. They deliberately targeted children who wouldn't be missed. The fates of the 12 redeemables children were varied and tragic. James, the oldest, committed suicide in 1998. Thomas disappeared after turning 18. Catherine died of a drug overdose in 2007. Some of the younger children were adopted by new families, others aged out of foster care. The damage was too deep, says Dr. Mororo. These children had been systematically brainwashed. It's not something you can undo with a few years of therapy. The 3 children from the 3rd floor, later identified as Sofia, Mateo, and Carlos Herrera, were reunited with their family, migrant workers who had reported them missing. It was a miracle that they were found alive, Cooper says. Based on Margaret's journal, Sofia was already being described as a nearly filled. She would have been the next to be discarded. Howard Folling died in prison in 2011, having never expressed remorse. Margaret died in the psychiatric facility in 2008, believing until the end that she was doing God's work. The Folling house was demolished in 1997. The land was converted into a community garden, where 25 trees were planted, 12 oaks for the redeemable children, 13 willows for the vessels. It's not enough, Cooper says. Nothing could ever be enough, but it's something. It's a way of saying, we remember. The case led to the Folling Act of 1998, which reformed adoption laws in Pennsylvania with more rigorous checks and oversight. The system failed these children, Lane says. We all failed them. The most haunting aspect is the knowledge that there might be more victims. I've made peace with the fact that we'll never know the full extent, Cooper says. But I haven't made peace with the fact that there are parents out there who still don't know what happened to their children. They deserve to have their stories told. So the macabre history of the Follings continues to unfold, a stark reminder that the darkest deeds often fester in the light, hidden behind a mask of respectability. It challenges us to see, to question, and to never look away. Before we end, we acknowledge the families of the identified victims: Maria Gomez, Tyrell Washington, Alexi Petro, Lucia Diaz, Kwame Johnson, Tran Nong, Sarah Blackfeather, and Dmitry Kowalski. Their lives were cut short by unimaginable cruelty. And for Jane Doe No. 1, John Doe No. 3, and the 3 other unidentified children, we may not know your names, but we bear witness. You mattered. You have always mattered. This has been the Ghastly Journal. Remember to subscribe. If you have information about missing children, contact the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Sometimes, even decades later, the truth can still come to light. Until next time, stay vigilant. The most important stories are often the ones that are the hardest to tell. Thank you for listening.